Hi there, welcome back. In this video, I'll be talking a little bit about Robert Frost, an American poet a lot of you probably have at least some brief familiarity with. He gets anthologized a lot, especially in early grades, because he's got a very straightforward style, talks about themes like nature and thoughtfulness. One of my favorite quotes by him, let's get that picture up first. It's kind of grainy, I need to find a better one. Poetry is a momentary stay against confusion. In other words, poetry is a way to make order out of perhaps a seemingly chaotic universe, even if it only stays that way for a very limited period of time. That's a nice little phrase. So, what do we need to know about him? He was actually a California boy. Spent his first decade in California, was born in California, but that's not really how most people know him, if they're familiar with him at all. He's kind of considered to be like the poet of New England nature. He was also valedictorian of his high school class. I don't know if that's the most important thing, but it does kind of establish him as an early talent. And even though he's often considered to be like the genteel New England countryman, um, his own personal life was actually pretty turbulent, um, especially as he began to get a little bit older. One of his sons committed suicide. Another one of his daughters had a bad mental breakdown, and he had problems with drinking. Um, I know it's almost a cliche to say that with writers. I don't really know what's exactly behind that. I'm sure somebody's written about it somewhere, though. But, reading most of his poetry, you don't get this feeling. I'll talk a little bit about some exceptions to that in a second, though. And for decades, he was known as the American poet, 19 teens, 20s, etc., 30s, on through the 40s, maybe into the 50s. He's got a certain kind of modernism, even though he talks about traditional themes such as nature and work. Um, he does advance the structure and style of poetry and kind of popularize it in a way that others hadn't done, or at least not to the same kind of popular sense. Robert Frost was very popular during his lifetime. It's a poet laureate for a while, so it's not like one of those other poets we've looked at earlier, like say Dickinson or Whitman, who really don't reach wide acclaim until far after they've passed. But anyway, he uses conversational rhythms. So even though a lot of his work might be in iambic pentameter, it flows like a regular conversation. He also uses the recognizable imagery of nature and of the countryside. And he's also got this terse, that means succinct or tight or to the point, rural voice. And we see this in a lot of his poems. Some of the poems that you're going to be reading include things like After Apple Picking, The Mending Wall. Both have very, powerful natural theme of nature and its importance. I don't know if I assigned you birches. I might have taken that one off. But to go back to this earlier bullet point, he does have some challenging poems too that are not as well known. That includes Death of a Hired Man, which is basically an extended conversation between a husband and a wife about an old worker that they used to hire to work on their farm, and he's come back and he's feeling sick and tired, and the wife wants to give him pity, but the husband's kind of like, look, he's a worker. That's not something we owe them. So it's really about trying to find common ground, even though they have these two very different philosophies. Home Burial is another one that has that kind of tense but kind of grim underpinning to it in its theme, and that's about the aftermath of a couple trying to move forward after they have to after they have to bury one of their infant children. Other poems that really uh, challenge that genteel, rural, nature poet persona would also include Fire and Ice, and that's a nice short one, but it talks about the end of the world in a couple different ways. Some of you already know the poem, the nature poem, "Nothing Gold Can Stay." Um, it makes an important cameo appearance in The Outsiders. That's the origin of the line "Stay Gold, Pony Boy." Um, Spoken by Ralph Macchio's character, whose name escapes me at this moment. He was also a strong proponent or a strong advocate of structured poetry. So in some ways, he's really traditional. Even though he does have some poems that mess a little bit with line length, um, there tends to be a very specific meter to them. His shorter poems that aren't iambic pentameter will have a rhyme. His longer iambic pentameter poems are what we call blank verse. And blank verse basically means iambic pentameter that doesn't rhyme. As far as free verse goes, in other words, that poetry that has no predictable or discernible structure or rhythm or rhyme pattern, this is what he says. And he comes up with some pretty good quotes and quips. Writing free verse is like playing tennis without a net. In other words, it's the challenge of getting your ideas into a poetic structure that makes for a good poem. Now we can go back and forth on this and agree or disagree, but it's probably one of the most concise and powerful ways that sentiment gets presented. What do we need to know about him as a pastoral poet? Pastoral poetry, there he is at his later age. It's a kind of poem where rural life, in other words, life living out in nature, farming, doing some kind of pursuit like that, is pure and simple. Um, and this is in contrast to the corruption and the artificiality, the high manners, the change of fads and fashions inside the city, or in an earlier time inside, say, like a royal court. And the pastoral poem is an ancient form of poetry. It's probably as old as poetry itself. Its actual name, pastoral, that word, pastor, comes from, I believe it's the Latin word for shepherd. And some of you might know that, if you go to church, or at least somewhat familiar with church, that the head priest in some congregations is called a pastor, a pastor, and again the word for shepherd. Also, if any of you are fans of tacos al pastor, I know I sure am. You're basically eating what is named tacos shepherd style. Now, I don't know how accurate that recipe is as far as like shepherds of, say, the Mexican region and Central American region would have it be, but dang, they're good. Now, what's also important to note about the pastoral poem is that it will often sentimentalize and idealize nature as something that is benevolent. In other words, giving, kind, helpful to, working on the side of human beings, in harmony with human beings. And I think all of us know that nature at its best can certainly feel that way. I think we've all had that experience of being out in a beautiful day, on a beautiful day in a gorgeous nature environment, and just feeling this kind of sense of bliss. But nature can also be, a horrifically violent force, and I think we all know that too if we watch the news at all. Nature is also responsible for, freezing blizzards, tsunamis, uh, earthquakes, all kinds of, events that ravage human beings. Another really important element of the pastoral poem is that God, or the notion of God, is seen as something that is present in all parts of nature. And this is important too, because it basically aligns nature with the divine. And it does kind of suggest the idea that uh, that the divine, or that God, is a benevolent force if you're seeing it in a pastoral poem, because once again, nature is seen as this very kind, very human friendly, human empowering, human enlightening force. But not all poems that are pastoral poems will mention God by name, but there will be a sense of the divine in the words that are used there. If we go back to Emily Dickinson and think about some of her poems, she rarely uses the word God in there, but she will talk about this incredible spirituality she gets out of being in nature. So that's Robert Frost in a nutshell. I hope you enjoy his poems. I will soon be posting the discussion section, the discussion question for week 8 coming up. Thanks for watching.